The CEO smiled as she fired the single dad in front of the entire company. 120 days later, that same room would fall so quiet that people could hear the hum of the air vents above them. On a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the 43rd floor of Sterling Dynamics looked exactly the way success was supposed to look. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the city skyline. Glass walls shimmered beneath soft white lights. Expensive suits moved through the corridors carrying tablets, coffee cups, and the confidence that came with six-figure salaries. Everything about the building whispered power. Everything except Ethan Walker. Ethan stood near the back of a crowded conference room, wearing a simple blue button-down shirt with sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. Most people barely noticed him unless they needed something fixed, reviewed, or quietly rescued before a deadline exploded into disaster. For nearly 3 years, he had worked inside the company without drawing attention to himself. He arrived early. He left late. He listened more than he spoke. And somehow, despite his calm nature, people often mistook his silence for weakness. Across town, his 9-year-old daughter Sophie was sitting in a classroom, carefully coloring a picture of a lighthouse. She always drew lighthouses when she missed her father. Her teacher once asked why. Sophie had smiled and said, "Because lighthouses stay standing even during storms." Ethan didn't know she had said that. But if he had, it might have been the first time in months he allowed himself to cry. Life had not been easy since losing his wife years earlier. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Every promise mattered. Yet no matter how difficult things became, he never allowed bitterness to settle in his heart. He simply kept moving forward one day at a time. Back inside Sterling Dynamics, employees filled every chair around the massive conference table. Quarterly results were being reviewed. Tension floated through the room like static before a thunderstorm. At the front stood Victoria Sterling, the company's celebrated CEO. At 35, she had become one of the youngest executives in the industry. Financial magazines loved her. Investors admired her. Employees feared her. Victoria possessed the kind of confidence that could inspire a room one moment and freeze it the next. She believed in results. She believed in efficiency. Most of all, she believed weakness had no place in business. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she paced beside a glowing presentation screen. "We are not here to reward effort," she said sharply. "We are here to reward outcomes." The room fell silent. No one challenged her. No one ever did. Victoria continued reviewing department performance, her voice calm but unforgiving. Then she stopped. Her eyes landed on a report in her hand. The atmosphere shifted. A few managers exchanged nervous glances. Ethan noticed it immediately. Years of reading people had taught him to recognize trouble long before it arrived. Victoria lifted her gaze. "Ethan Walker." His name echoed across the room. Every head turned. Ethan slowly looked up. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria held the report between two fingers. "Do you know what this is?" Ethan remained calm. "The logistics assessment from last week." "Correct." Her smile appeared, but it carried no warmth. "And do you know what happens when someone delays a critical project?" The room grew still. Outside the windows, clouds drifted over the city. Inside, dozens of employees watched in uncomfortable silence. Ethan felt their eyes on him. Yet his expression never changed. He simply stood there, steady and composed, like a man who had already survived harder days than this one. Victoria took a slow step forward. The smile remained, but something about it made the room colder. And for the first time that morning, a feeling settled deep inside the hearts of everyone watching. They sensed they were about to witness something they would remember for a very long time. Victoria let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then she placed the report on the conference table and folded her arms. 3 weeks ago, she said, our logistics division missed a critical delivery window. One client, one deadline, one mistake. Her gaze never left Ethan. And according to this report, the responsibility leads back to you. A murmur moved through the room. Small, nervous, curious. Ethan looked at the report, then back at Victoria. That report does not tell the full story. Victoria laughed softly, not loudly enough to sound cruel, but loudly enough to invite others to agree with her. A few people shifted in their seats. Nobody spoke. "The full story?" she asked. "Please enlighten us." Ethan remained calm. The delay happened because I flagged a compliance issue. If we had shipped the order on schedule, the company would have violated federal regulations. Victoria tilted her head slightly. And yet the shipment was delayed. Because it needed to be. According to you. The room grew quieter. Outside, a light rain began tapping against the glass. Chicago's skyline faded behind a curtain of gray clouds. Ethan noticed several managers avoiding eye contact. They knew what had happened. They knew he had raised concerns weeks earlier. But nobody stepped forward. Fear often speaks louder than truth in rooms filled with power. Victoria slowly walked around the conference table. The sound of her heels echoed across the polished floor. You know what I find interesting, Ethan? She asked. People who fail always have an explanation. Ethan did not react. People who succeed, she continued, have results. Several executives nodded. Not because they fully agreed. Because agreeing felt safer. Victoria stopped directly across from him. Sterling Dynamics cannot afford employees who create obstacles. Ethan looked at her steadily. Protecting the company is not creating obstacles. For a brief moment, something flashed across Victoria's face. Irritation. Challenge. Maybe both. No, she said quietly. Protecting the company is producing outcomes. Something you have failed to do. The room froze. Ethan felt dozens of eyes watching him. Waiting. Hoping he would argue. Hoping he would lose his temper. But dignity often reveals itself most clearly when humiliation seems justified. He simply stood there. Calm. Steady. Respectful. Victoria picked up another folder from the table. Human Resources has reviewed the matter. She opened it. Effective immediately, your employment with Sterling Dynamics is terminated. The words landed like cold steel. Several employees looked down. One woman near the back covered her mouth. Another manager stared at the table. Nobody moved. Nobody protested. Ethan absorbed the blow without flinching. Deep inside, disappointment settled over him like winter snow. Not because he lost the job. Jobs came and went. What hurt was knowing that honesty had become a liability. Victoria slid a document toward him. You can collect your personal belongings today. Ethan glanced at the paper. Then he looked around the room. So many faces. Some sympathetic. Some relieved it was not them. Some completely indifferent. He thought about Sophie. Her school project. Her smile that morning when she handed him a drawing before leaving for class. A lighthouse standing against a storm. The image drifted quietly through his mind. He signed the document. No argument. No speech. No anger. Victoria appeared almost surprised. That is all, she asked. Ethan placed the pen on the table. I hope the company succeeds. The simplicity of the answer seemed to confuse her. That is what you have to say, she pressed. Ethan nodded once. Yes. The room remained silent. Victoria expected resistance. She expected excuses. She expected emotion. Instead, she received grace. And somehow that felt more unsettling than any confrontation could have been. Minutes later, Ethan stepped into the elevator carrying a small cardboard box. A framed photo of Sophie rested on top beside a coffee mug and a notebook filled with years of observations and ideas. The elevator doors slowly closed. Floor 43 disappeared from view. As the elevator descended, Ethan stared at the city beyond the glass. Cars crawled through rain-soaked streets. People hurried beneath umbrellas. Life moved forward without asking permission. His phone vibrated. A text message appeared. It was from Sophie. How is your day going, Daddy? Ethan looked at the screen for several seconds. Then he smiled. A tired smile. A real one. He typed back slowly. I will tell you everything tonight, sweetheart. And we are still getting pizza. He pressed send. Above him, 43 floors higher, the meeting continued. Reports were discussed. Numbers were reviewed. Decisions were made. Yet an uneasy feeling lingered in the room long after Ethan left. Because sometimes the strongest person is not the one giving orders. Sometimes it is the person who walks away carrying nothing except character. And though nobody in that room realized it yet, the story they believed had ended was only beginning. That evening, the rain had followed Ethan all the way home. Water streaked down the apartment windows while the city lights shimmered beyond the glass like distant stars struggling to break through the clouds. The apartment was small but warm. The scent of tomato sauce and baked dough filled the air as a pizza box sat open on the kitchen table. Sophie was already talking before Ethan had fully taken off his jacket. She was describing a science project, a class presentation, and a disagreement between two friends, all in the same breath. Ethan listened carefully, smiling at the right moments, asking questions, giving her the one thing every child hopes for after school: his attention. For a little while, neither of them mentioned the job. Neither of them mentioned the future. They simply enjoyed being father and daughter. The storm outside could wait. Eventually, Sophie noticed the cardboard box resting beside the couch. Her eyes moved to the framed photograph sticking out from the top. Then she looked at him. "You really lost your job, did you not?" Ethan took a slow sip of water. "Yes, sweetheart." Sophie lowered her gaze. "Was it your fault?" The question was innocent, honest, the kind of question only a child could ask without judgment. Ethan reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "No, but sometimes life does not always reward people immediately for doing the right thing." Sophie thought about that. "That does not seem fair." Ethan smiled softly. "It usually is not." Silence settled between them. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Rain tapped against the windows. Then Sophie said something that stopped him completely. "Mom used to say that good things take longer to grow." Ethan felt his chest tighten. It had been years since his wife passed away, yet certain memories still arrived with surprising force. He could almost hear her voice, almost see her standing in the kitchen smiling. Sophie noticed the change in his expression and reached for his hand. "She would still be proud of you, Daddy." Ethan looked away for a moment, not because he was weak, because some forms of love remain powerful long after they are gone. Later that night, after Sophie fell asleep, Ethan sat alone in the living room. The apartment was quiet except for the rain. He opened the notebook he had carried home from Sterling Dynamics. Hundreds of pages filled with observations, strategies, forecasts, and ideas covered the paper. Years of thoughts, years of patterns, years of solutions that few people had ever bothered to hear. He slowly turned the pages. Numbers, sketches, market projections, operational improvements, entire business models. The deeper he looked, the clearer one truth became. Losing the job had not taken away his knowledge. It had not taken away his experience. It had not taken away his value. Somewhere around midnight, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. Ethan glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed a name he had not seen in almost 7 years. Daniel Brooks. Ethan stared at the name without answering. Daniel had once been one of the brightest financial strategists in the country. The two men had worked together long ago, before tragedy changed Ethan's life. The phone stopped ringing. A moment later, a voicemail notification appeared. Ethan hesitated before pressing play. Daniel's voice filled the room. Older now, more measured. "Ethan, I know it has been a long time. Maybe too long. But I heard what happened today. Listen, there is something important we need to discuss. Call me when you can." The message ended. Ethan sat motionless. The rain continued falling outside. Something about the call felt unusual. Not urgent. Significant. Like the first distant rumble before a storm arrives. Across the city, in a luxury penthouse overlooking the Chicago River, Victoria Sterling stood alone beside a wall of glass. The skyline glittered beneath the night sky. Normally, firing an employee would not occupy her thoughts for more than a few minutes. Yet tonight was different. She found herself remembering Ethan's final words. Not his disagreement. Not his defense. His grace. The way he had wished success upon the very company that had just dismissed him. Victoria frowned slightly. She could not explain why the memory bothered her. She simply knew it did. Far below, traffic moved through wet streets. Above, clouds drifted across the moon. And in two very different parts of the city, two people stared into the darkness, unaware that events already set in motion were beginning to pull their lives toward a future neither one could yet see. The next morning arrived with clear skies and cold air sweeping through Chicago. Sunlight spilled across the city, reflecting off glass towers and steel bridges as commuters hurried through another ordinary day. Yet for Ethan Walker, nothing felt ordinary anymore. He stood in the kitchen pouring orange juice while Sophie packed her backpack. The uncertainty of unemployment lingered quietly in the room, but neither of them spoke about it. They had already made an unspoken agreement. Fear would not be allowed to sit at their table. Sophie adjusted the straps on her backpack and looked up at him. "Are you going to find another job today?" Ethan smiled gently. "I am going to figure out what comes next." Sophie nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Children often have more faith than adults. Before leaving, she hugged him tightly. You always do. After she disappeared down the apartment hallway, Ethan stood alone for several moments. Then he picked up his phone and called Daniel Brooks. The call connected on the second ring. I was wondering when you would call, Daniel said. Ethan walked toward the window overlooking the street below. You said something important. A brief pause followed. Meet me for coffee. 2 hours later, Ethan stepped into a quiet cafe near Lake Michigan. The place smelled of roasted beans and fresh pastries. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while sunlight filtered through tall windows. Daniel Brooks was already seated in a corner booth. Time had added gray to his hair, but not to his sharp eyes. He stood immediately when Ethan approached. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Daniel extended his hand. It is good to see you, my friend. Ethan shook it firmly. You too. They sat. Coffee arrived. Small talk lasted less than a minute. Daniel leaned forward. I heard what happened at Sterling Dynamics. Ethan nodded. News travels fast. Because people are shocked. Ethan gave a faint smile. I doubt that. Daniel stared at him. You still do not understand, do you? Ethan frowned slightly. Daniel lowered his voice. Most people at that company have no idea who you are. The words lingered between them. Ethan looked down at his coffee. That was intentional. Daniel nodded. I know. Years earlier, Ethan Walker had been known in very different rooms. Rooms filled with investors, founders, analysts, and executives. He had built strategies that rescued failing companies. He had advised firms that later became industry leaders. His reputation had once opened doors across the country. Then his wife became sick. Everything changed. Meetings became hospital visits. Growth charts became medical charts. Boardrooms became waiting rooms. When she passed away, Ethan walked away from nearly everything. Not because he could not continue. Because he no longer cared about status. Sophie needed a father more than the business world needed another executive. Daniel knew all of it. He had watched it happen. You disappeared, Daniel said quietly. Most people assumed you retired. Ethan stared through the cafe window. Cars moved slowly along the street outside. Maybe part of me did. Daniel shook his head. No. You stepped away. There is a difference. Silence followed. Then Daniel opened a leather portfolio he had brought with him. Several documents rested inside. Financial reports, market analyses, corporate forecasts. Ethan immediately recognized the logos printed on the pages. Sterling Dynamics. Daniel slid the documents across the table. Take a look. Ethan began reading. His expression remained calm, but Daniel noticed the subtle narrowing of his eyes. The numbers were troubling. Revenue projections had weakened. Several major clients showed signs of dissatisfaction. Operational costs were climbing. Risk exposure was increasing. Small cracks. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. But cracks nonetheless. How did you get these? Ethan asked. Daniel smiled faintly. People still talk to me. Ethan continued reviewing the reports. The deeper he looked, the more familiar the patterns became. He had warned about some of these vulnerabilities months earlier. Quietly, respectfully, professionally. Nobody had listened. Back at Sterling Dynamics, Victoria Sterling sat inside her executive office reviewing quarterly forecasts. Her jaw tightened as another report landed on her desk. A major client had requested an emergency review. Another wanted contract adjustments. The concerns were manageable, but they were becoming more frequent. Victoria disliked patterns she could not control. She pressed a button on her desk phone. Get me the operations team. Her assistant answered immediately. Right away. Victoria looked out at the skyline. Something felt different. Not dangerous. Not yet. But the certainty she usually carried had begun to shift ever so slightly. Across the city, Ethan closed the final report and leaned back in his chair. Daniel watched him carefully. What do you see? Ethan was quiet for several seconds. Then he answered. I see a company moving too fast to notice where the road is ending. Daniel nodded slowly. And if nobody changes course? Ethan folded the reports neatly and returned them. His voice remained calm. Then eventually the market will do what pride never can. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What is that? Ethan looked out the window again. Forced someone to listen. Outside, the wind moved across Lake Michigan. Inside the cafe, two old colleagues sat at a small corner table, unaware that decisions made long ago were beginning to echo into the present. Somewhere between ambition and humility, between power and wisdom, the first pieces of a much larger story were quietly moving into place. Over the next several weeks, life settled into a strange rhythm. Every morning, Ethan walked Sophie to school. Every afternoon, he searched for opportunities, reviewed market reports, and took calls that most people never knew existed. To the outside world, he looked like a man rebuilding after a setback. In reality, he was doing something far quieter. He was listening to the market, listening to old relationships, listening to signals hidden beneath headlines and earnings reports. Some evenings, after Sophie finished her homework, they sat together at the small kitchen table drawing pictures or working through math problems. Those moments mattered more to Ethan than any title ever could. Yet even in those peaceful hours, he could feel the world shifting beyond the apartment walls. One Friday afternoon, Daniel Brooks called again. His voice carried unusual energy. "I just got out of a meeting." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Good news or bad news?" "Depends on who you ask." Ethan smiled faintly. "That usually means both." Daniel laughed. "A major client is reviewing its relationship with Sterling Dynamics." Ethan remained silent. "You are not surprised, are you?" Daniel asked. "No. You warned them." "I warned everyone who would listen." Outside the apartment window, autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk below. Chicago was beginning its slow transformation toward winter. Seasons changed gradually. Companies often did the same. Daniel lowered his voice. "People are starting to ask questions." Ethan stared at a notebook lying open on the table. "Questions are healthy. Not for executives who built their reputations on certainty." After the call ended, Ethan returned to his work. But that evening, another call arrived. Then another. Former colleagues. Old clients. Industry contacts he had not spoken with in years. Some wanted advice. Some wanted insight. Some simply wanted to reconnect. One conversation led to another. Quietly, almost invisibly, doors that had once seemed closed began opening again. Across town, the atmosphere inside Sterling Dynamics felt noticeably different. The confidence that had once flowed through the executive floors now carried traces of tension. Meetings lasted longer. Conversations became more guarded. Reports were scrutinized more carefully. Victoria Sterling noticed all of it. She sat at the head of a conference table reviewing projections while department heads presented updates. "What about the North Star account?" she asked. A manager shifted uncomfortably. "They requested additional guarantees." Victoria frowned. "Again?" "Yes." Another executive cleared his throat. "Several clients have expressed similar concerns." The room fell quiet. Victoria hated silence when it carried uncertainty. "Then solve it," she said firmly. Nobody argued. Yet nobody looked reassured either. After the meeting, Victoria returned to her office and closed the door. For several moments, she stood alone beside the window overlooking the city. She had built her career on decisive action, on confidence, on strength. But leadership became far more complicated when confidence stopped producing results. Her phone buzzed. A message from a board member appeared. "We need to discuss long-term strategy." Victoria stared at the words. The message was professional, respectful, yet she could read the concern hidden between the lines. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in a quiet corner of a public library while Sophie attended a weekend reading program nearby. Spread across the table were financial journals, market forecasts, and pages of handwritten notes. He was not searching for revenge. That thought never crossed his mind. Revenge was loud, temporary, emotional. Ethan preferred solutions. He always had. As he reviewed another report, his phone vibrated. A new email appeared from someone he had not expected. The sender's name immediately caught his attention. One of the most respected investment groups in the country. Ethan opened the message slowly. His eyes moved across the screen. Then he stopped. For the first time in weeks, genuine surprise appeared on his face. The message was short, direct. They wanted a meeting. Not next month. Not next week. Immediately, Ethan looked up from the screen. Across the room, Sophie sat with a book in her hands, smiling as she turned another page. Sunlight streamed through the library windows, casting long golden beams across the floor. Everything looked peaceful, ordinary. Yet deep beneath the surface, forces far larger than either of them could see were beginning to move. And somewhere inside Sterling Dynamics, where executives still believed they controlled the future, the first distant cracks were becoming impossible to ignore. 3 days after receiving the email, Ethan stepped into a private conference room overlooking Lake Michigan. The building was quiet, elegant, and intentionally understated. No flashing logos. No unnecessary displays of wealth. Just polished wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, and people who understood that real influence rarely needed an introduction. A woman in her early 60s stood as he entered. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her expression carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Ethan Walker," she said warmly. "Thank you for coming." Ethan shook her hand. "Thank you for inviting me." Her name was Margaret Holloway, managing partner of Holloway Capital Partners. For decades, her firm had quietly acquired struggling companies, repaired broken leadership structures, and transformed overlooked opportunities into extraordinary success stories. She gestured toward a seat. "Please." Ethan sat. Several executives joined them around the table. No one wasted time with formalities. Margaret slid a folder toward him. "We have been studying Sterling dynamics for months." Ethan remained silent. "And recently," she continued, "your name began appearing in places we did not expect." Ethan glanced at the folder, but did not open it. Margaret smiled slightly. "Former employees, clients, consultants, even competitors." One of the executives leaned forward. "Different people, same story." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" The executive answered immediately. "Whenever something difficult needed solving, they came to you." Silence settled over the room. Ethan had never sought recognition. Yet sometimes character leaves footprints whether people intend it or not. Margaret folded her hands. "We are not interested in rumors, Ethan. We are interested in patterns." She nodded toward the folder. "Open it." Ethan did. Inside were reports, ownership charts, financial assessments, and strategic forecasts. Much of it centered on Sterling dynamics. The deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. Major shareholders were becoming concerned. Market confidence was weakening. Several institutional investors had quietly reduced their positions. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Yet beneath the surface, pressure was building. Margaret studied him carefully. "What do you see?" Ethan turned another page. "A company with strong assets." Another page. "Good people." Another page. "And leadership problems that are spreading faster than anyone realizes." The room became very still. One executive exchanged glances with another. Margaret simply nodded. "That is exactly what our analysts concluded." Ethan closed the folder. "Then why bring me here?" For the first time, Margaret smiled. "Because analysts identify problems." She leaned forward slightly. "Leaders solve them." Back at Sterling Dynamics, Victoria Sterling faced a very different kind of meeting. The boardroom felt colder than usual. Several board members attended remotely through large screens mounted along the wall. Quarterly numbers appeared across multiple displays. Victoria stood at the front presenting recovery plans, revised projections, and operational adjustments. Her delivery was flawless. Her confidence remained visible. Yet beneath the surface, tension had begun to accumulate. A board member interrupted. "How soon can we stabilize client retention?" Another asked, "What is our contingency plan if market confidence weakens further?" A third questioned future leadership strategy. Victoria answered each one professionally. But as the questions continued, she noticed something disturbing. They were no longer asking about short-term performance. They were asking about long-term trust. After the meeting ended, she remained alone in the boardroom. The city skyline stretched beyond the windows. Gray clouds drifted above the Chicago River. For a moment, she remembered Ethan standing calmly in that very building months earlier. She remembered the way he never defended himself aggressively, the way he never begged, the way he never tried to embarrass anyone. The memory irritated her for reasons she could not explain. Meanwhile, Ethan left Holloway Capital's office carrying nothing except the folder Margaret had given him. Outside, the wind coming off the lake was sharp and cold. Chicago's streets bustled with afternoon traffic. People hurried past without recognizing him. That suited him perfectly. His phone vibrated. A message from Sophie appeared. "Do not forget my school concert tomorrow." Ethan smiled immediately. "I would never miss it." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued walking. Yet his mind remained occupied by the meeting. Not because of opportunity, because of responsibility. The folder in his hands represented more than financial data. It represented consequences, jobs, families, futures. Decisions made in executive offices eventually reached ordinary people living ordinary lives. Ethan understood that better than most. Behind him, high above the city, Margaret Holloway stood at her office window, watching traffic move below. One of her partners approached. "What do you think?" Margaret did not answer immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the skyline. Finally, she spoke. "Most people chase power." Her partner nodded. "And him?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "He walked away from it." The partner frowned. "Why does that matter?" Margaret smiled. "Because those are usually the people who can be trusted with it." Neither of them realized how quickly events were beginning to accelerate. Quiet conversations were becoming strategic meetings. Strategic meetings were becoming decisions. And somewhere deep within the financial world, a countdown had already begun, even though almost nobody could see the clock. The school auditorium glowed beneath warm stage lights as folding chairs filled with parents, grandparents, and teachers. The scent of polished wood and fresh paint lingered in the air, while excited conversations echoed through the room. Ethan sat in the third row, exactly where Sophie could see him. He never missed the important moments. No matter how complicated life became, he always showed up. On stage, Sophie stood among dozens of students preparing for the concert. She looked nervous at first. Then her eyes found her father. Ethan smiled and gave her a small thumbs up. Instantly, her shoulders relaxed. Sometimes courage arrives in the form of a familiar face. The performance began. Children's voices filled the auditorium with simple songs and imperfect harmony. Parents recorded videos. Teachers smiled proudly. For a brief hour, the world felt uncomplicated. Ethan allowed himself to enjoy it. Yet even during those peaceful moments, his phone vibrated twice inside his jacket pocket. He ignored it. Whatever business waited outside those walls could wait a little longer. Sophie only got one fourth-grade concert. After the final song ended, applause swept through the room. Children rushed toward their families. Sophie ran directly into Ethan's arms. "Did you hear me?" she asked breathlessly. "You were the loudest one there." Ethan laughed. "I heard every word." Sophie grinned. "I knew you would come." The certainty in her voice stayed with him long after they left the school. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to sleep, Ethan finally checked his phone. The first message was from Daniel Brooks. "Call me." The second came from Margaret Holloway. "We need to meet tomorrow morning." Important. Ethan stared at the messages. Neither sounded alarming. Yet both carried the weight of something significant. The following morning, Chicago woke beneath a sky filled with low gray clouds. Ethan arrived at Holloway Capitol shortly after 8. This time the atmosphere felt different. More people occupied the conference room. More documents covered the table. More urgency lingered beneath every conversation. Margaret greeted him with a nod. "Thank you for coming on short notice." Ethan sat down. "What happened?" Margaret exchanged a glance with one of her partners. Then she slid several newspapers and market reports across the table. Headlines filled the pages. Investor concerns. Analyst downgrades. Questions about leadership stability. Questions about future direction. Questions that had once remained private were now becoming public. Ethan reviewed the reports carefully. The room remained silent while he read. Finally, he looked up. "The pressure is accelerating." Margaret nodded. "Faster than expected." Another executive leaned forward. "Several institutional investors are demanding changes." Ethan said nothing. He simply continued studying the documents. The numbers told a story far louder than any headline. Confidence was eroding. Trust was weakening. Momentum was shifting. Across downtown, inside the executive offices of Sterling Dynamics, Victoria Sterling stood before another emergency meeting. This time the mood was impossible to ignore. Board members asked harder questions. Investors requested direct explanations. Department heads appeared increasingly anxious. Victoria answered every challenge with professionalism. Yet she could feel something changing around her. The certainty she once inspired no longer arrived automatically. It had to be earned. And earning it was becoming more difficult each week. After the meeting ended, one board member remained behind. An older man named Richard Coleman. He had served on corporate boards for more than 30 years. As everyone else left, he paused near the door. "Victoria." She looked up. "Yes." Richard hesitated. "There are conversations happening that you may not be aware of." Victoria's expression hardened slightly. "What kind of conversations?" Richard studied her carefully. "The kind that happen when people become worried about the future." Then he left. Alone in the boardroom, Victoria stared at the empty chairs surrounding the table. For the first time in a very long time, she felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of growing in silence. Meanwhile, several miles away, Ethan stood beside a window overlooking the city after the meeting at Holloway Capital concluded. Cars moved through crowded streets below. Autumn winds swept between the buildings. Margaret approached quietly. The next few weeks are going to matter. Ethan nodded. I know. Margaret looked out at the skyline. The question is whether people recognize what is happening before it is too late. Ethan remained thoughtful. Somewhere beyond those towers stood Sterling Dynamics. Somewhere inside that company, thousands of employees continued working, hoping leadership would find answers. Ethan understood what was truly at stake. Not stock prices, not headlines. People, families, futures. And as clouds gathered above Chicago once again, the distance between two very different paths was beginning to narrow far faster than anyone realized. By the beginning of the fourth month, Chicago had surrendered completely to late autumn. Cold winds swept through the city streets, carrying fallen leaves across sidewalks and beneath rows of glowing office windows. The days felt shorter. The nights arrived earlier. And inside Sterling Dynamics, the atmosphere had changed in ways no amount of executive optimism could disguise. Employees still arrived every morning. Meetings still filled conference rooms. Reports were still printed and reviewed. Yet beneath the routine, anxiety had begun to spread. People sensed it in hallway conversations. They saw it in nervous glances exchanged during meetings. They felt it whenever leadership promised stability, while uncertainty continued to grow. Victoria Sterling sat alone in her office late one evening, long after most employees had gone home. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. A half-finished cup of coffee sat untouched beside her desk. Financial reports covered nearly every surface. Numbers, forecasts, investor communications. None of them brought comfort. Her phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of another board member. Victoria answered immediately. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, she slowly lowered the phone and stared into the darkness outside. The board had scheduled an extraordinary meeting. Officially, it was a strategic review. Unofficially, everyone understood what that meant. Questions were no longer being asked quietly. Decisions were approaching. Across town, Ethan sat at the kitchen table helping Sophie prepare for a history presentation. Colored markers were scattered across the table. Construction paper covered one side. Sophie was explaining historical figures with the seriousness only a fourth grader could achieve. Ethan listened carefully, smiling whenever she became overly dramatic about people who had lived hundreds of years ago. For a little while, business disappeared. Markets disappeared. Pressure disappeared. There was only a father and his daughter sharing an ordinary evening. Eventually, Sophie looked up from her project. Daddy, yes. Are things getting better? Ethan paused. Children often ask questions that adults spend years avoiding. Some things are. Sophie considered that answer. And some things are not. Ethan nodded gently. That is usually how life works. She smiled. Mom used to say storms do not last forever. Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled back. She was right. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan stood by the apartment window overlooking the city. His phone buzzed. A message from Margaret Holloway appeared. Board meeting confirmed. Monday morning. Ethan read the message twice. He knew exactly which board meeting she meant. The countdown that had been quietly advancing for months was nearly finished. Yet instead of excitement, he felt something else. Responsibility. Because no matter what happened next, thousands of employees would be affected. Families would be affected. Futures would be affected. The situation had long since become bigger than any individual. The following day, Sterling Dynamics held another executive briefing. Victoria entered the room with her usual confidence, but even she could feel the difference. Conversations stopped when she entered. Executives appeared careful with their words. The room no longer felt united. It felt uncertain. Halfway through the meeting, an operations director cleared his throat. There is another issue. Victoria looked up. What now? The director slid a report across the table. Several investors have increased communication with the board directly. Silence followed. Nobody needed to explain what that meant. Confidence in management was weakening. Victoria felt irritation rise inside her. Not because of the report itself, because she had spent years building Sterling Dynamics into one of the most respected companies in the industry. She had sacrificed weekends, holidays, relationships, everything. And now people who had never carried that burden were questioning her leadership. Yet, deep down, another thought lingered beneath the frustration. A quieter thought, a more uncomfortable one. What if some of those concerns were justified? The question arrived unexpectedly and refused to leave. Meanwhile, at Holloway Capital, Margaret and her partners finalized preparations for Monday's meeting. Documents were reviewed. Legal teams completed final assessments. Strategic plans were examined one final time. The atmosphere remained calm, but the importance of what lay ahead was impossible to ignore. One partner looked toward Margaret. "Do you think they are ready?" Margaret folded a report and placed it neatly on the table. "No one is ever fully ready for change." "And Ethan?" Margaret smiled faintly. "He has been ready for a long time." Outside, snowflakes began falling over Chicago for the first time that season. They drifted quietly through the night air, settling across rooftops, sidewalks, and city streets. Inside apartments, offices, restaurants, and boardrooms, people continued living their ordinary lives. Most had no idea that Monday morning would become a turning point. Most had no idea that decisions made behind closed doors would soon reshape futures across the company. And as the first snow of the year covered the city in silence, the distance between what had been and what was about to happen grew smaller with every passing hour. Monday morning arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Chicago looked quieter than usual, as though the city itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Traffic moved slowly through white-covered streets. Office towers reflected the pale winter sun. And on the 43rd floor of Sterling Dynamics, executives, board members, and investors gathered for what many believed would be the most important meeting in the company's history. Victoria Sterling arrived early. She stood alone inside the boardroom she had commanded for years. The polished table gleamed beneath soft lighting. The skyline stretched beyond the windows exactly as it always had. Yet nothing felt familiar anymore. One by one, board members entered. Conversations remained polite but restrained. The atmosphere carried a quiet gravity. Everyone understood that decisions made today would shape the future of the company. As the meeting began, Richard Coleman stood and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for attending," he said. "After extensive review, consultation with investors, and strategic evaluation, the board has reached a unanimous decision regarding the future leadership of Sterling Dynamics." Victoria sat perfectly still. Her expression revealed nothing, yet her heartbeat seemed louder than the room itself. Richard continued, "Before we proceed, there is someone we would like to welcome." The boardroom doors opened. Footsteps echoed softly across the floor. Several people turned toward the entrance. Then silence arrived. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that changes a room forever. Ethan Walker stepped inside. He wore a dark suit, simple and understated. No dramatic entrance. No arrogance. No triumph. Just the same calm dignity he had carried the day he left the company. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Faces around the table reflected disbelief, confusion, recognition, and shock. Victoria stared at him. Her mind struggled to reconcile the image before her with the memory she carried. The employee she had dismissed. The man she had underestimated. The father who had walked away without bitterness. Richard gestured toward an empty chair near the head of the table. "Please join us." Ethan nodded politely and took his seat. The silence deepened. Richard looked around the room. Over the past several months, investors, advisors, and strategic partners have worked closely together to evaluate the company's future. He paused. After extensive review, a new leadership structure has been approved. Several board members exchanged brief glances. Then Richard spoke the words that changed everything. Effective immediately, Ethan Walker will serve as chairman of the board. No one moved. No one spoke. Outside, snow drifted gently beyond the windows. Inside, years of assumptions collapsed in a single moment. Victoria lowered her eyes. For the first time in her professional life, she did not know what to say. Richard continued explaining the transition, the investor support, and the strategic plans already in motion. But many people barely heard him. Their attention remained fixed on Ethan. Finally, when the formal discussion concluded, Richard turned toward him. "Would you like to say a few words?" Ethan stood slowly. Every eye in the room followed him. He looked around the table, not with judgment, but with quiet respect. Then he spoke. A company is not a building. His voice was calm, steady. It is not a stock price. It is not a title. The room remained perfectly still. A company is people, families, employees who work hard every day believing their efforts matter. He glanced briefly toward the windows overlooking the city. Leadership is not about proving you are the smartest person in the room. It is about making sure everyone else has a chance to succeed. Several board members lowered their eyes. Others nodded slowly. Ethan then looked toward Victoria. Not with anger. Not with victory. With grace. Every person makes mistakes, he said. I have made many myself. What matters is what we learn from them. Victoria felt emotion rise unexpectedly in her chest. Months earlier, she had believed strength meant control. Standing there now, she realized real strength looked very different. It looked like humility. It looked like character. It looked like the man she had once dismissed. After the meeting ended, people slowly filtered from the room. Some offered congratulations. Others offered apologies. Ethan accepted both with equal kindness. Eventually, only he and Victoria remained. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria looked at him. I was wrong about you. Ethan smiled gently. We are all wrong about people sometimes. Her eyes filled with quiet regret. Why are you not angry? Ethan thought about Sophie. About his late wife. About all the difficult years that had shaped him. Then he answered softly. Because carrying anger costs too much. The words settled over the room like sunlight after a storm. Later that afternoon, Ethan stepped outside the building. Snow crunched beneath his shoes. Across the street, Sophie ran toward him wearing a bright winter coat and an enormous smile. He opened his arms, and she nearly knocked him over with the force of her hug. Ethan laughed. Truly laughed. The kind that comes from peace, not victory. Above them, the city continued moving forward. Cars passed. Lights glowed. Life carried on. But for one father and one little girl, something beautiful had been restored. Not power, not status, respect. And sometimes that is the greatest reward of all. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share where you are watching from and tell us what part stayed with you the most. And if you believe dignity, kindness, and second chances still matter in this world, we would be honored to have you join us again for another story that reminds us why character is always worth more than pride.